Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to the West Valley Center for Spiritual Living. I'm Reverend Karen Rice, and I'm really happy to be here today. I believe the message that I've prepared is rich. It's got some quality to it that is not only timely, but I'm a bit excited to share some information with you. So thank you for joining, and how wonderful it is to know that we are absolutely connected. I just take a moment to bless this space, to know that everything is in divine order, and by right of consciousness, I know that this message is thereby the perfect message for each person listening, no matter where we are. We're absolutely in the perfect place because right where we are, God is. And so I know it's done. I give thanks for it and let it be. And so it is. Well, I have prepared a message that I think is going to be especially appreciated by people with a bit of a science of mind background. So any kind of new thought experience you have, any spiritual, a marriage of spirit and science, anything that brings you into this way of looking at mental science from a spiritual perspective. I have some really good tips in here today. I have some really useful things to say. And I actually also am going to share with you this morning a couple of aha realizations that I had this week that it just feels important to share. So the title of my message is Discovering New Worlds. And the title of that, of this message comes from Dr. Ernest Holmes' gorgeously relevant book, A New Design for Living. There could not be a better book for 2020 than this single book that was written and published in the latter part of his career. And the quote that intrigued me and inspired me comes from a chapter of that same title, Discovering New Worlds. So listen to this quotation I'm about to read. It's short, but and you might think you heard it, but it's got something in it that I think is worth pondering and really sitting with for a minute. Dr. Holmes says this: "Let us take a more considered look at the world about us in order to ascertain its relationship to the unseen world of the mind." I'll repeat it. Let us take a more considered look at the world about us and try to ascertain its relationship to the unseen world of the mind. Here is something very specific in a request for us to recognize that there's more going on than what meets the eye. So he's asking us to really consider this, to take a concentrated, in-depth look at what's going on in the world. But then he says, so that we can ascertain the relationship of what's happening and what's going on in our mind regarding what's happening. This is pure science of mind. This is the philosophy that we teach and that he founded so long ago. And there's something very important in that, because what we're talking about is the law of reciprocal action. It is that place where we speak to the importance of knowing what you believe is what you will see in front of you. And in other words, that there's a law of correspondence in this universe that we live in. And the way we interpret what we're seeing in the world that we're living in really creates our personal experience of the world. And that's what I want to talk to today. But I'm going to do it in a slightly different way than I usually do. First, let me read you the next part of the reading that comes right from the book, because he speaks to something we can definitely use. He's talking about current events, and we're sort of smothered in the ideas of what's going on in the news lately. Holmes said, "Many of the stories and the photographs that are appearing in the newspapers and the magazines could have a greater significance for us if we would read and look at them from a fresh viewpoint. And so there's something really wonderful in the way that we are reminded again and again that, we really do have a certain way we look at the world, but there's always something a little more fulfilling than what immediately meets the eye. So we want to look at the news and the stories and the images that come in the photographs that we look, whether you're looking online or in the newspaper or watching your TV. We want to look at that and recognize that there is a way we can see all of that with a fresh viewpoint. I think this is good information for everybody right now. And I was also thinking that when Dr. Holmes wrote such strong statements, and when you can feel it kind of resonate in you, when it tickles me, when I'm looking for something to talk about on Sunday and it kind of grabs my breath for a moment, what I realize is that he was tapping into a consciousness that was greater than his own. And what that tells us is that that consciousness exists right now. That right now we can tap into that very same information and it will be useful for everything that's going on in our lives, in the news, in the world, and in our own minds. So we are sort of the center of that of the new world, the possible new viewpoint of the world, and that's because what Holmes is telling us, it comes from the realm of our own consciousness. If I see anger, or if I'm feeling angry at the things going on in my life or the world, then everything I look at is colored by that anger. So you might say life will look fiery or hot and in that angry sort of way. On the other hand, if I'm feeling tender and loving, then as I look out on the same circumstances in the world, I'm going to have a completely different view. And what we forget is that we're at choice. So it's not improper. You're not doing anything wrong if you're feeling angry. There's a call in anger. There's a call for us to return to prayer and to look back again for the truth that's still there. God's still right in the middle of whatever all of that is. But it really tells us that we are empowered to cast a hue of color or a mood on everything we see, everything we encounter, and everyone we encounter. So there's this law of correspondence. There's a way we study and we realize that what we demonstrate in our life, the experiences we attract or that we partake in, we're all participating or creating at some level all the time. It tells us that there's a direct, exacting, proportionately accurate feedback that comes from our state of mind. In every encounter we have, we will only get back what we're able to see. And I was thinking about how important this is, and I began to sort of review some of the things I've been through in my life, and I realized that I wanted to say today that I believe some of the most significant changes I have gone through in my own personal experiences, and you have gone through your own personal experiences. So I want you to be thinking, I'm going to tell a story, but I want you to see a way in which you can look for that same story in your own life. All of my significant changes happened once I believed they could happen, and not a moment before. So I had a long list of stories to tell you, and I narrowed it down to just one. When I was a young married woman and began having babies, I had a great interest in childbirth, and I became a lay-trained childbirth educator. So what that means is I did all the studying, and I had a doctor that supported me and wanted me to instruct his patients. So at some point, and I was very successful at it, very successful. There was a long waiting list, and it was sometimes I would have to teach twice in the same day in order to get all the people in that needed to have the class, and the word spread, and it was a really enjoyable time in my life. But there came a point where I desired to earn a real certification. I didn't want to be self-taught anymore. I felt like I wanted the credibility behind me because people were coming out of the woodwork in looking for what I was offering. And so I found the perfect organization, and I signed up for the educational part of earning a certificate, and I worked my way into this really in-depth course of study. And I was probably a little bit more than halfway toward reaching that certificate, and I realized that I didn't think I could do it. I suddenly felt like all the other students in the class were smarter than I was. They understood things that I didn't get, and my confidence was waning, and it seemed like it was hard work, and I really didn't think I had everything in me to complete all the practicums that were required, the real physical work of it. And so I remember going to my husband and I said, honey, I'm going to pull out. I can't do this right now. And, I was always, I had kids. I was probably pregnant because I was whole 70s. I was pregnant all the time. And I remember telling him I'm going to do this. And I could see the sadness in his face because I was so close to accomplishing this goal. And he encouraged me to try and stick it out. And he realized at some point that I had really made up my mind I wasn't going to be able to do it. So he did the sweetest thing, and he said to me, do what works for you. And then if you change your mind later, you can always come back and complete the process. And that's exactly what happened. About a year later, I felt that burning inside of me again. I got that desire. It's like, no, I really want that certification. I really want that to complete this process, and I want to be more credible in people's eyes when they come to me for this teaching. So I went back, got back in the classes again, and I finished and I got my certificate. Now, here's the part of the story I want you to use in your own life. I couldn't do it until I believed I had what it took. Right? Nothing and no one could convince me that I should stay the course until I made up my own mind. And the moment I made that decision, it was done. You might say I had a similar experience when it came time for me to candidate for a church. I'd been an assistant minister, and then the circumstances in my life did this radical turnabout. It was not a fun year. It made 2020 look like a breeze. A lot of major changes in our family that just were tumultuous and scary. And later, after months passed, I realized that the changes in the life we were living created an opportunity for me to look for a church that would involve moving away. And I looked at open pulpits. I saw that there was an open pulpit in Peoria, Arizona. I didn't know where that was. I had never heard of it. And it turned out I had two daughters here. One lived in Glendale, and the other lived in Litchfield Park. And if you know the area, that's like Peoria's right in the middle of all of that. I filled out my package, I sent it off to home office, and then they process it with the church. You don't contact the church personally. And I remember thinking in that process while you're waiting for months, I waited for months. And I'm thinking like, well, wait a minute. There must be a more qualified ministers that are looking for a place to do ministry. And I started talking myself out of it. But then when I went back to do my spiritual work, I recognized exactly what I was doing. It is done unto you as you believe. And in that moment, I had one of those great revelations and claimed it. And it was almost as though I could hear this laughter of God. I mean, like a literal laugh and a little voice that lightly said, perhaps you are the most qualified and the best fit for this community. And then, of course, that I'm the one that was chosen to fill the pulpit. So it doesn't happen until we believe it. And I think that we all have these experiences, and I'm really inviting you to notice what those have been in your own life, where you recognize you had a change of mind and you used, whether or not you realized you were using spiritual principle, you used something, a skill, in this way that we transform in this deeply personal and intimate way into a higher way of thinking. We're living in, I've been thinking it's like stormy weather. It's like the times that we're living in, it's like a great stormy time. And in this current state of affairs, of sort of everything that's broken apart in the world, and in the country and in our personal lives, and the way that we have been isolated and we wear masks and we don't sit close to each other, there's this distinct separation that we are living in, and we're not comfortable with it. But what I want to say is, I want us again to be aware that what happens in the mind and consciousness of the greater sort of soul of humanity is the way I think of it. Carl Jung always referred to it as the collective unconscious, and Holmes spoke about it all the time too. And I think of it in the way that Holmes and Troward spoke about it as race consciousness. That there's just sort of this general consensus, and it's cloudy and it lingers over us, and we're all involved in it. So now, if you look at the way we teach science of mind principles, we talk about noticing the tendency of your own thought. What is the tendency of your own thought? So it's easy to say that if I'm worried about health, and come on, we got that in our face because we're living in a time of great contagion. We are told, that we have to protect ourselves and each other. So if that's what's on my mind all the time, I am likely to forget or not focus equal or greater time on the incredible way that we have health and vibrancy, and the human body is so miraculously created that it has this intelligence that heals automatically. So if I'm already concerned about my health for whatever reason, and now I'm living in this environment that we've called pandemic, now you can see the tendency of our thought, and the collective thought, certainly together, is not toward health and vibrancy and a state of well-being. It's just a fact. But for every fact, for every challenge, there's also a spiritual principle that can bring us back to truth. So it is... for those of you who are still saying, why is there so much chaos in the world right now? I mean, I don't have an answer for it, but what I want to, I do, I have lots to say about it, of course, but what I want to say is that the why is not as important as how you choose to walk through every day, probably for all your life, not just now, but especially right now. We want to use our spiritual tools, the skills that we are freely given. So the result of living in these stormy conditions of life, you'll notice I haven't said anything about an upcoming election, but I just, in the back of my mind, you got to know that's there too. The result of all of that is that we're feeling broken. We're feeling divided. We're feeling separated from our good. And that means for me that not because I'm a spiritual leader, but because I'm alive and I'm on the planet right now, that means to me I want to do my spiritual work and keep my consciousness and the tendency of my thought into what's possible, not all the brokenness. So we're talking about being very conscious and being intentional, as we do often. We're talking about going deeper and using all of this glorious philosophy and these ideas and these spiritual practices that we teach and live, and knowing that we're doing good for not only ourselves, but in then what ripples out from us and into the world. Centers for Spiritual Living, the parent organization of all the CSL centers, did something very unique this year that they haven't done before, and that is they created a guide for voting. It's quite lovely. I'm going to make sure, if I haven't already asked Kay to post it, I'm going to make sure you can get it so that you can just link on it, that you don't have to go looking for it. We'll post it. Perhaps I'll get it on the website so that we can, and then I'll link it to the newsletter. It's lovely. It's long. It's like 14 pages long. But I want to tell you the bottom line of what they're inviting us to consider as we're moving toward an election is to know what our own values are. Know what your values are. It's always time. It's always good to reprioritize what's most important to us. So in addition to your personal values, they talk about what are the values of us as an organization, and then they remind us to always stand, as we're moving through these divisive days, make sure that you stand in principle as often as you can. This is what Holmes was meaning when he said, discover new worlds. Look for that inner realm of consciousness. And we want to really be clear about doing that, knowing that that new way is already in us and that we can step into it in a great, useful and practical way. You know, we give spiritual tools for free. Some of you are at home right now, maybe in your pajamas still, having your morning coffee, and every Sunday we offer information that's uplifting and inspirational and practical in application, and you can have that for free. Imagine that you can get once a week. You could listen on any day of the week right now. You can access this message and share it with other people. And we talk about how to move through challenges. We talk about personal growth and transformation and renewing our minds, and how we can be more connected to what we're thinking, and how that creates a better outcome for us. And we have an emphasis on spiritual practices that can really create a sense of real intimate connection with God, with the divine, with the infinite intelligence that, has created all of life. And as I was thinking about all of that, I had this thought that was kind of interesting. I think that I use different tools in order to help you think about what the tools are. I think I use different tools for different challenges, for different things that come up in life. So, what I notice is if I'm feeling judgmental, if I'm having a lot of strong opinions about people that have different ideas or see life differently than I do, if I recognize that sweet little divine part of me catches that, then then I counter that. The spiritual tool I would use is to call on compassion, so that I can do a practice that will open my heart more, or forgiveness, so that I can be more accepting of opinions that are different than mine. But that is a very different spiritual tool than if I am looking for spiritual encouragement to push me through to meet a project to completion, which is a completely different tool than a spiritual tool I would call on if I'm having something. I've got a really unsettling relationship with a significant person in my life. So what we're talking about is that as we identify the situations, it will lead us, it works like a compass to lead us to the spiritual quality, or the divine quality that's missing in whatever it is that we're looking to expand. If I need more love to heal a relationship, then I call on that power of love, or that presence of love in my life, and that's what I want to focus on. And if I am needing guidance, I might call on the power of light, that divine illumination to show me the way, to direct me through some kind of circuitous path that I might be blinded for a little while. So we have all these great, peace and power and plenty and harmony and perfect order and all of those things. And so each of those is like a different tool. But Abraham Maslow said something really important, and you've all heard this quote before. Maslow said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. Right? So we've heard that, and it's kind of nice to be reminded of that because, we can do a lot of pounding. But what I read this week that was fascinating to me, and I never realized, but that quotation came from Abraham Maslow's work that he did he was a great contributor in the field of psychology. He came at a season where, in the 30s and the 40s, where the world was ripe for an expanded understanding of how the mind works. And one of the things that Maslow noted, he's of course is famous for the hierarchy of needs and that lead up the pyramid to self-actualization. But one of the things we haven't heard about Maslow is that he also was working at a time where the only, the primary psychiatric medications in use, the primary medications they used for mental health were thorazine and stelazine. And consequently, because those were the tools that they had in the world of psychiatry, consequently, everybody with mental health issues was designated as experiencing some kind of psychosis because they had this great medication to treat psychosis. And Maslow came along and said, no, that's not right. If your only tool is a hammer, you're gonna just keep hammering everything like it's a nail. And that there were other possibilities. And so he just opened the door for a greater expansion of understanding how to diagnose in mental illness, but in addition, the types of treatment that would then later be drawn forward from this new possibility. So they called it the law of the instrument. But in layman terms, what they're saying is, if you give a small boy a hammer, everything he encounters gets a pounding. And when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, I went right back to raising kids. And there used to be, when my children were little, thank God they don't make them anymore, but there was this little wooden thing. Do you remember? They had this little wooden thing with the holes drilled out, and then you had these colorful pegs and a wooden hammer. Bam, 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 bam. And the parents never bought them for their own kids. You would buy them for other people's kids because they made you crazy. And not only did they love to beat, the toddlers would love to just beat those little pegs down, but then they would go through the house and they would be hammering everything else. And eventually, if there were siblings, they would be hammering each other, and it just wasn't a good thing. So we understand how inviting that is. And I'm using that because it's a safe metaphor, but there are a lot of other ones that have moved through my mind in preparing this material. I want to just say, let's have more tools. Let's really devote ourselves to spiritual practice and classes and study so that we can have conversations that help each of us to expand our toolboxes so we're not just hammering things out. I think that Facebook is a really good example of how people are just pounding their opinions on one another, and it makes me laugh because I often think it's like, well, that would never change my mind about an issue. So let's look at expanding the possibilities of how we manage ourselves and how we change our view to have a fresh view of what's going on in the world and all of that. One of the things that I read this week in my own personal study was an article for ministers, and it came out of a mainstream Christian newsletter for ministers, and it was about leading in challenging times. And at the top of the article, it started by saying, well, what is it that ministers do? And then they went on to say, well, here's a list of things we do, a bullet-pointed list of things that ministers do. And it made me laugh, so I knew I had to share it with you. We encourage the faint of heart. We strengthen the weak. We restore the wayward. Not sure I've ever restored anybody wayward, let alone myself. And here's the one that got me. we protect them from false teachings. And when I read that, man, it took me back to my young adulthood and all those years of being a new wife and a new mother, all those years where I was devoted to a very stringent Christian fundamental faith, and where we were taught that. And it really was a big issue to imagine that we want to do everything we can to not let the devil sway us to the wrong side. You know, the faith that I aligned myself to had a very apocalyptic belief system that it was the end of the world, and that the end of the world wasn't coming, in a certain year ahead, that it was coming any day, and that we lived every day, that we used all the scriptures that reinforce the belief that it would be like a thief in the night. You wouldn't even know it. You can't expect it, but you better be ready, and it's coming now because all signs point to it. And I'm grateful for that, because it was tiring to live every day believing it was the end of the world. And it was scary. And it was that fear that I began to feel the weight of that allowed me to reevaluate my values and my beliefs and my worldview. And eventually I was able to say, I'm so tired of being afraid all the time. Not only that, but you got to be good all the time, right? So, you think if you're going to make it through this horrible thing, you got to be a good girl. So, you try to be good. At the end of the day, you go, woohoo, good success. I did good today. Oh no, tomorrow's another day. I got to do it again. And it just had this heaviness to it. And I did that for a lot of years. And then something shifted inside of me that allowed me to consider other views. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because as I was playing with all of these ideas this week, I began to realize how frequently people are talking about this as the end of time or the end of the world. And I began to think of how that is creating a greater imbalance, a greater sense of safety. We have no sense of safety as we're walking through our lives right now, because there's such a powerful suggestion in our minds that it's not safe, right? I mean, and all the things that I've already stated, we know. You all know where you are in your own relationship to all of that. But here's what I want to say. I want to just sum it up this way. How much time do you worry or think or believe this could be the end of time, or the end of the planet as we know it, or human life? Or are you also investing time considering, concentrating on the way we would desire to be living our lives on the other side of all this sequestered time? On the other side of an election? Can you imagine in the world that you desire to live in? And I want to tell you that you can, but you must choose it. You absolutely must choose it. And so when I go back to that question that says, or that statement that says, ministers protect us from false teachings, what I want to say, in the way I can't protect you, I can't, oh boy, I try sometimes, but I can't, and that's a good thing. You can't protect me either. But here's what I want to say, so that I align myself to what ministers should be doing, and that is, be smart about the way you deal with your social media. That's all. I'm just going to say that. I could say a lot more, but be smart about your relationship with social media. I am asking you to ration your time with news reports or other people's opinions, what you see on TV or what you read in the newspaper or on your device. And I'm really going to ask you to spend some time becoming aware of your own biases. Notice that you do have biases, and the funny thing is that everybody else could tell us what our biases are, and we would probably argue But become aware, pay attention, be conscious as you're moving through life, and be curious about the things that really still have question marks. Be curious and open so that newness, which is desiring to emerge on the planet right now, can have that space, can use us as a vessel, as a channel to emerge through. Be thinking about the world you desire, and you better be thinking a lot about it so that we put more into that than we do on the downside of all of that. It's heavy to live as though the world's going to end every day. Do your work, and remember, you have limitless spiritual resources in a toolbox you may not have recognized that you own. So discover new worlds, as Holmes says. Discover new worlds. Rethink your worldview. And as Marcel Proust so perfectly wrote, another quote that'll may be familiar to you: the real voyage of discovery should be not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. Use your eyes to look Godward. Get your head up out of the muck and the mire, and in fact, take your feet out of the mud and the muck and step into higher ground and move into that place where there's unchanging principle that is always active and is always promoting life, growing life, expanding life. Make sure you see beauty and you find things that make you laugh. I was thinking about the watermelon. Isn't that a funny thought? Have you thought about a watermelon lately? I was thinking about the watermelon. I'm not sure why, but I've been thinking about a watermelon, and not just like a watermelon like we get today with no seeds, but I'm thinking about when I was a little girl in the early 1950s, when I was a little girl, and we would have a barbecue in the backyard. And I know I've mentioned before, my parents had many siblings, and for a period of time in the early 50s, my father was one of 5 brothers that lived in a 1.5 mile radius. We all lived in walking distance of each other. One uncle lived right down the street, 5 houses away. And so we would take turns whose house we would go to. And I had a lot of cousins and we had a lot of good times. But when it was our turn to do barbecue at our house, my dad loved it. He would clean up the yard. He would make everything look pretty. He'd mow the lawn. He'd scrub up the barbecue. Mom would get the food all ready in the kitchen. And then Daddy would always get a small child's swimming pool. He'd go down to the 5 and 10 Cornet down the street, and he'd get a pool, and he'd put it in the backyard, and he'd fill it up with ice, and then he'd put all of the beverages for us. I'm just remembering there was probably no bottled water, and in the middle of the big pool of ice, he'd buy the biggest, prettiest watermelon he could find. And he'd take this big old, like blimp size, that dark green. Remember when they were all dark green? And he'd take that watermelon and he'd put it in the center of that swimming pool, and he'd swish the ice around it. And he would look, I could see his face. He would get so excited. You could tell that his mouth was watering, thinking about that delicious watermelon. And he would always say to us, I can't wait when that watermelon is ice cold. It's going to be so sweet and juicy. And we just anticipated how good that watermelon was going to be. But the best part of the night, well, I don't know, maybe that was the best part. But eventually after dinner, somebody would lift that watermelon out of that swimming pool, take it over to the picnic bench, get a big old knife and whack it open. And then they would cut it, and each of us kids would get a half of a round, and so we'd take it, and we were out in the backyard. We would just be out there on the grass, and we would just put our face in our watermelon, and we would spit the seeds out on the grass. Grown-ups were doing pretty much the same thing, except I know us kids, it just drips all over. It's all juicy and runs down your arms. And then at the end of the night, we would go to the hose and we would squirt ourselves down and spray each other. And I just have the best memories of watermelon on those hot summer nights. Here's a fact about a watermelon seed that I didn't realize. The watermelon seed, a little black watermelon seed, has the power of drawing from the ground, pulling from the earth, and through itself 200,000 times its weight in order to sustain itself. Everything it needs, it pulls from the earth itself 200,000 times its very own weight. If that's true, even just pondering the possibility of that immediately makes me imagine, what are we capable of drawing into our lives? 200,000 times greater than we are, and out into fruition. How many seeds of possibility come from that which we pull from the earth and from the heavens and into ourselves as a vessel out into creation. So that's how I want to leave you. More love, more beauty, more truth, more harmony. Think of it like a big, ripe, juicy watermelon with that big red heart at the center. We have a lot to think about. A lot to think about. So I would like to just take a moment to ground these ideas into our own consciousness by way of prayer. So if you'll just join me for a moment, we'll turn within. We'll set aside all of the images spoken, the ideas, the suggestion of tools and spiritual practices, and we just know that all of that is already ours, and we turn within. And we feel for a moment the peace of God. And I recognize in this stillness that all the power and all the love and all the joy of the universe is indwelling in each and every one of us in an inexhaustible supply. And therefore we are always given everything we need. We are always right where we belong. And in this place of standing in such truth, in this renewed view of what's going on in our lives and in the world, we are strengthened to be called home again, to pull through our own being that which we need 200,000 times greater than we are, that we are given this thing called life, that there is an intelligence in our being that does guide and direct us and carry us through all of the situations that are a part of our everyday living, and into this greater experience of being a part of this great, big, beautiful whole of the universe. And so I feel something within me that is stimulated. It is the activity of life itself. It is the call to prayer. It is that vibration that is healing, that is restoring our wholeness. And in our openness, we become increasingly aware of this truth of our being, that everything is given already, that we are perfect and whole and complete, and that as we are willing to image that in our minds, to call on that truth, to align ourselves to the spiritual qualities of life and the principles that guide us and that hold this entire universe together, we simply know that life is good. And so I say, thank you, God. Thank you, life. Thank you, infinite Spirit. How wonderful to know that even in a beautiful watermelon, there is a story of life. We receive, we give thanks, we let it be, and together we say, and so it is. And so I would just remind you that thank you so much for remembering to get your offering in, to circulate your goods so that we can keep doing good work here in the sanctuary. I'm really anxious to see you, itchy, I can feel it, I can taste it and see you, and just know that I love you very much. Speaking of spiritual tools, starting a class on Tuesday called What the Hell? HELL is an acronym for Head-On Effective Liminal Living. That's how we're living in the gap right now, and how to use it's all about filling up your tools, except instead of a tool box, I'm calling it the hand basket, because hand basket and hell go so good together, right? So Tuesday, information is on the website or the newsletter. At the very least, you can call the office to get enrolled, so I can send out the Zoom. It'll be a Zoom all on the internet, all on the in the what you call it, video. It'll all be videoed, but I want it live so that we can interact with each other. $40 for 4 weeks. And by the way, someone pointed out to me that the 4th week is election day, so it should be the timing of the class is probably no accident. So join us on Tuesdays. I love you. Have a blessed week. Eat some watermelon.